There we go.
Welcome everyone to today's Zoom presentation sponsored by the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. I'd like to welcome you all, and in particular, I'd like to welcome Ruben Nelson, the speaker for today. He's going to give us a talk about Alberta's struggle for the future, an insider's view. And he's going to be looking at this as a futures thinker, and which is something that is really important in today's world, because we need to have people who can understand where we are and how we got here and try and project that into the future. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to deal with. As a native Albertan, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ruben has to say with respect to Alberta's future. And with that, welcome everyone, and I'm over to you, Ruben.
Thank you, Jean, for that kind and generous introduction. And I want to thank everybody on the call, not only because you're here today, but because many of you are faithful participants in this series by KCOR, and it has become the most significant regular series in Canada, and I'm thankful for that. Today's topic is Alberta's struggle with the future, an insider's view. I am an insider to Alberta. I was born there at the end of the Depression. I was formed and raised there. The Alberta landscapes are imprinted on me the way chicks imprint on their mothers. And to this day, my heart sings more on the Alberta landscape than anywhere else in the world. I want to begin by just setting out the way I frame our times, because this provides the standard against which we can judge how Alberta is doing in relationship to the future. The first foundational insight is that our perspective on the world determines how we behave in the world. This, it seems to me, is profoundly true. And it's important not only for the study of history, but for thinking about the future. Because if you're in a situation where the situation needs to change profoundly enough that merely changing behavior won't do it, then you have to work with people to change their perspectives. But of course, that's easier said than done, because our perspectives on the world are a function of many things. Our time in history, the culture we inherit and its form of civilization, the physical place of our formation, it's both its geography and its geology, our own biology, our mother tongue, the range and adequacy of the ways we were or were not nourished, our unique formation and experience as persons, our capacity to make reliable sense of the world. You need to know that my research, as well as that of others, but I'm among those who think that our times require us to fundamentally change our perspectives and our behavior, and to do so at every scale, from the uniquely personal to the civilizational. And the fundamental reason is this, that we who are modern techno-industrial cultures, and I will use that MTI for modern techno-industrial, are in a double bind. That without economic growth, we who are MTI face societal collapse. And that's true, both for monetary reasons and for social psychological reasons. That means we must grow the economy forever and keep on cannibalizing the earth or face economically driven societal collapse. But since 1971, as Bill Reese and others have pointed out, economic growth has put us in the condition of ecological overshoot, a condition which also leads to societal collapse. We're consuming the Earth's non-renewable resources faster than she can regenerate them, and therefore we must cut back on production and consumption or face ecologically driven societal collapse. Which path to societal collapse do you choose? And you're probably aware that in our modern cultures, we've chosen to ignore the second point and to focus almost entirely on the first, which is why there's so much talk, even in Glasgow at COP26, about ensuring that there's economic growth. In fact, the fundamental strategy for dealing with climate change is a strategy that will drive economic growth forever. The trouble is, there's no evidence that we can actually create growth forever without cannibalizing the earth. So we're in more trouble than we know. And this situation raises new and vital questions. What if the main lesson that we are to learn from our MTI way of grasping and being grasped by reality is that our MTI form of civilization is now at a dead end, that we've passed peak modernity and are into a long and slow societal collapse? What if we cannot even grasp the reality and significance of this insight, as long as we insist on being MTI persons in MTI cultures, with MTI ways of knowing driving our MTI aspirations? What if we really are in a Wittgensteinian fly bottle? What if the way out requires us to become wise, systemic, integral, and meta-reflexive as persons, families, communities, and whole cultures? If any of that is true, as I believe it is, then the core drama of the 21st century is not the drama that we think we're in. It's not the much imagined commitment to endlessly improving MTI cultures and extending them to the ends of the earth. You see that in the UN's Sustainability Development Goals. Rather, we're in quite a different situation. Not much imagined, much less understood, but that at one and the same time, we need to face up to and manage the decline and even collapse of our modern techno-industrial cultures. And so far in history, no culture that has gone into collapse has been able to manage its decline. And we need to loosen the grip of our MTI sense of reality on us, and to loosen the grip of MTI reality on us. And this is the key to becoming a truly open person, open to a dramatically different future that will transcend our modern techno-industrial form at every level of our existence, from unique persons to whole cultures. So that now we've got a framework to judge Alberta as well as other places. Let's just set the scene about Alberta. What do we have to work with? Well, it's an extraordinary and diverse landscape. It may be the only place on the planet where rivers rise that actually head into three dramatically different oceans: the Arctic, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean. We're protected on all four sides, and that makes us somewhat insular. By the vast north on the northern side, by the Rocky Mountains on the west, by Saskatchewan, all that land that goes all the way to Halifax on the east, and by Montana and all that land that goes down to Panama on the south. So it means that rats have trouble finding us, but it also means that ideas often have trouble finding us. I'll come back to that. Up to now, we've had cold winters and temperate summers, and the cold winters have saved us hundreds of billions of dollars, as well as helped protect our soil, because the soil gets sterilized in the winter by the cold, and it means we don't have to use the kind of pesticides and herbicides that you do even in South Dakota, let alone Tennessee. Indigenous people have been here for 11,000 years plus. They had access to horses and some European tools before they met any Europeans. In fact, Anthony Hendy was the first European to set foot in Alberta in 1754. And if you think about what's going on in Europe in 1754, well, by then, the steam engine's underdeveloped. The Royal Society has been founded for almost 100 years. Books have been printed by movable type for 300 years. The Renaissance is long over. The Reformation is still rolling out. In other words, Europe is well on the way to becoming a modern techno-industrial culture. And so that's the form and the understanding of life that was brought by Europeans to Alberta. And what's more, for the next 100 years, there really were only relatively few people. They were fur traders and missionaries. The folks really didn't begin to arrive until the late 19th century. And by then, the Palliser expedition had come to survey the land and lay out lots so settlers didn't have to kill each other over this lot is mine and not yours. The Northwest Territories were acquired from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1870 by Canada, and therefore what became Alberta eventually in 1905 became part of Canada. The mounted police arrived in the 1870s to deal with pesky American whiskey traders and bring in that wonderful Canadian phrase, peace, order, and good government. So as I said, we didn't really have a lot of Europeans arriving until the 1880s, 1890s, 1910. In that 30-year period, 3 million people arrived on the Canadian prairies, roughly a third of them in Alberta. And of course, they're coming from cultures that are well in the way to becoming modern cultures. And so the implications of this for Alberta are dramatic. It is seen as a place that's a bonanza in waiting by Europeans, because they're going to create here a new version of what the world they already know, but they can bring the best of that world. So Alberta gets a leg up by starting in the late 19th century with all the best of the late 19th century technology and ideas. We don't have to overcome 16th century European ideas because they were never here. We're a new colony for Eastern Canada, and I say that not with bitterness. It's just that Canadians in Eastern Canada knew that they were a colony of Britain and earlier of France. And what you do with a colony is you take raw resources and process them and then sell back manufactured resources to the colony, so the colony serves you twice. And so these new prairie provinces, including Alberta, were producers of raw resources so that manufacturing could occur in Ontario and Quebec, and it did. You may remember that Bill Davis, the Premier of Ontario, put up billboards in the 1970s that said, "Buy Canadian, keep Ontario working," which of course makes my point. It took 2 or 3 weeks of Bill being beaten up in the press for him to realize that while he was speaking truth, it was an embarrassing truth, and he took the billboards down. One of the things that's interesting about Alberta is the economy has always been driven by hard outdoor and therefore male-dominated work. It was true from the fur trade. It was true as people came here to be homesteaders and work the land. It's true of those who cut down the limited timber in southern Alberta, but far more of it in central and northern Alberta. It's true of the coal miners and then later of the oil and gas people. So Alberta has a more modern male culture than any other place in Canada. And a modern male culture was formed well before the women's movement. In fact, a modern male culture has yet to be affected much by the women's movement. And that's true in Alberta. And if you want to understand some of the attitudes of Albertans, including our present premier, you need to understand that fact. It's also true that boys love technology, and therefore Alberta specializes in new operational technologies. We're fiercely open to new things to do as long as they actually do something in the sense of moving dirt. We're not a place anybody would come to for thought leadership. There is a deep sense, given the above conditions, there's a deep sense of neighborliness and cooperation, because the odds were high that your neighbors may have been people that in the old country you wouldn't have even spoken to because they were so different. But here, if you did not work with and speak to and cooperate with your neighbors neglected you and then buried you in the spring. So there's an incentive to develop a kind of loose form of multiculturalism within a basically British frame of reference. And of course, for Indigenous people, Alberta, invaded by European settlers, is a disaster in waiting. But if you put all that together, you can see that Alberta was set up. It was set up in a way that it makes it almost impossible to fail as a modern 20th century jurisdiction. And you can see there the list of things by which we judge modern jurisdictions. How are they doing as by 20th century standards? Not an accident that Alberta's population has grown more per capita than any other place in Canada as we've attracted people. Not an accident that Calgary is often on the list by various surveys to identify the best cities in the world to live, and occasionally it's been chosen as the best city to live in. That's because we've become an extraordinarily successful 20th century modern techno-industrial jurisdiction. Here's StatsCan data that shows that it shows up financially. The oil patch is high cash flow enterprise. No virtue on our part, but because it is, our per capita income is higher than any other part of Canada. You can see that whether you're looking at 81 or 2005, our centennial, or 2016, that our per capita income is sometimes more than 2.5 times that of the poorest places in Canada, or almost close to 2. And in 2016, you got to remember that's 2 years into a drop in oil prices when we had lost 100,000 jobs. That would be like Ontario losing 350,000 jobs. We had lost 100,000 jobs, and the oil price is down at $40 a barrel rather than 110. But we're still head and shoulders the richest place in Canada. Okay, so now we've got a framework, and now you've got a sense of Alberta's history and how we were set up, in effect, simply by that history to succeed. So how have we done and how are we doing? Well, not surprisingly, there's a whole range of notable firsts. The first cooperative in Alberta was in the Northwest Territories, 1895. The first community college on the prairies, 1910. I mean, this is decades before Ontario created anything like a community college. And it wasn't done by the province. It was done by the local Methodist Church in Calgary. So that Mount Royal College became an arm of the Methodist Church and later the United Church of Canada, and it had a conservatory of music. I mean, this would be like Napanee, because Calgary's population back then was about the same as Napanee's today. This would be like Napanee, Ontario, deciding it needs a community-based community college, not one funded by the government, with a conservatory of music. And of course, the closest conservatory of music to Calgary in those days was San Francisco. The next closest, the Royal Conservatory in Toronto. The Persons case, the case that changed the status of women for all women in Canada forever. Prairie women, 3 of the 4 of them from Alberta. That same year, the Prairie provinces gathering together and beating out an agreement with the federal government that the BNA Act would be honored, which says that natural resources belong to the provinces and they have the right to manage their development. Funny money in 1936. For many people, they kind of laugh at us in Alberta for the funny money in the Depression. But think of it another way. This is the first attempt, possibly in the world, to develop a community script. And as you know, there are lots of places all over the world that are deciding that they need a community-based script that is independent of the value of money that is set by central bankers. And here was Alberta pioneering that, except the Supreme Court the next year said, you can't do it. And so in 1938, we extended branches of the Alberta Treasury, that's the finance department, into little towns all over Alberta, lending families and farmers and businessmen money so that they could survive the 30s. And so Alberta today is the only province that actually owns a bank. 1938, again, really early, the first regulation of natural resources. And note that they created a conservation board to conserve both the resources and to conserve the land the resources are on or under. And it's not an accident that by 1950, Saudi Arabia had adopted the model of the NRCB to regulate their oil and gas industry. The very first think tank in Canada, 1967, the Human Resources Research Council. They did the very first futures project in Canadian history. They did a Delphi study about the future of Alberta, and they predicted, among other things, that the SOCRED time was over and that they would be defeated in the next election, which turns out to be true. I'll come back to that. The first vice president of the environment was appointed in an institution in Calgary. It wasn't done provincially. It was the federally owned Petro-Canada. But Doug Bowie became the first vice president of the environment. And of course, at the time, many people, particularly in the oil patch, which wasn't then at all sensitive to the environment, laughed at this. But of course, they all have now the functional equivalents of the same. The second think tank in Canada was founded in 1970, the Canada West Foundation, driven by Peter Lougheed. Public policy was brought to Canada by Peter Lougheed and by Pierre Trudeau. Trudeau federally, Peter Lougheed provincially. Both of those people understood that we could no longer govern whole jurisdictions focused on programs and program administration, that we needed a more coherent understanding, which today we call management and policy development. And it was new to Canada, driven by these two people. By the late 70s, we had more money coming into the treasury than we could spend. And Peter Lougheed had enough imagination to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, which at the time was a lot of money, into the development of Kananaskis country, which protected forever a lot of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. The Alberta Heritage Trust, the Heritage Foundation for Medical Research, founded in 1980, meant that by 1990, a province with 10% of the Alberta population was doing 20% of the medical research in Canada. There was a Premier's Commission on Future Health Care for Albertans in 1990. Sadly, its report was ignored because shortly thereafter, the Premier who had commissioned it resigned. And as you know, new premiers tend to dismiss the work done by their predecessors. But the first volume of that commission may be the wisest thing said about public health care in the 20th century in Canada. I'm one of the few people who still own it. The Alberta Research Council finally appointed a vice president for foresight in 2007. This is the first institution in any sector in Canada to understand that foresight is important enough that you need somebody at the executive level to be responsible for it. And the Oil Sands Leadership Initiative was created in 1910. 5 of the largest oil companies were talked into sharing their research on the environment. It was pointed out to them that they're all responsible to the same environmental regulations and they're not competitors. And so they finally got around to creating the first permanent joint research project done by the industry itself. Now, this is 40 years after the first joint research project had happened in IT in Texas. But then again, nobody suggests that the oil patch is current. And so what I'm saying is Alberta has had every possible advantage, from landscapes to the time it was born into history, to the kinds of people it attracted and held. Northrop Frye used to say it matters when you're cast into history because you take with you all the assumptions and presuppositions of the time. And sadly, Alberta formed an identity around a 20th century modern techno-industrial understanding of life, and did that so deeply that it is inconceivable today that we can think of any other future for ourselves. And that shows up in the building program of the University of Calgary. The first university in Alberta was not in Edmonton, it was across the river in Strathcona in 1912. Calgarians were upset. They wanted a university of their own, and they argued for 40 years that they should have it. And in the 1960s, the provincial government finally said, you can build a University of Calgary. Here's 640 acres of land that had never been broken on the outskirts of Calgary, build any university you want. And we were so deeply immersed in the conviction that as modern men, you got to remember, this is a male-driven culture. There's no women on the first board of the U of C. And they know what the universe is about. They don't have to spend 7 seconds asking the question, what would we do today in order to make sure that our university is relevant 50 years from now? They said, hell, we know what universities are. They've got arts and they've got science, and those two things have nothing to do with each other. And so we'll build a building for each. What's more, we're good economic Albertans, so we'll use the same plan for both of them, but we'll paint one blue and the other red, and we'll put one north and south, that's the blue one, and the other east and west, that's the red one. So science is east and west, and arts is north and south. So unless you're colorblind and challenged in terms of your sense of direction, you know what building you're in. Those are literally the first two buildings on the University of Calgary, neither of them built with any forethought. And they know that students have bodies, so they build a gym as the third building, and the books have to be shared, so they build a library. What I'm saying is, this is typical of the way we do things, where we know we're good at getting stuff done, and we're cocky, as successful males are, that there's no need to actually think deeply about what we're doing it. Let's just get on with it. And so Peter Lougheed killed the Human Resources Research Council 5 years after it was formed, because he knew that this was a remarkable group of people who had gathered there. These guys were really good because they had predicted in some kind of what seemed like a semi-magical way the decline of the Socred government when nobody in Alberta believed that they were going to decline. They had governed for almost 40 years and it looked like they were going to go on forever. But he said to himself, these are not my guys. Can I trust them? And if they're not my guys, they could be trouble for me. And so in the fall of 71, when he was elected, he called Lorne Downey, the head of HRRC, and said, Lorne, I'm not going to rescind the legislation, but your budget for next year starting April 1st is $1. If you can keep the place going on $1 or money you raise, good on you, I'll even back you. If you can't, plan now to wind down. And he didn't have the wit. Peter Lougheed was extraordinary in so many ways, but he didn't have the wit to ask, this new thing called future studies, nobody else in Canada is doing it in a formal way. So it's this new kind of strange, almost occult thing. Is there anything here of value? Might it in time become a multi-billion-dollar global business, which in fact it has? In other words, do we have the best franchise in North America if we keep it and nurture it? And of course, those questions were not asked. Downtown Calgary has been totally rebuilt in my lifetime. The downtown that I grew up in has been replaced with office buildings. That's all there are is office buildings. Calgary is a model where you go to work early in the morning, the same time you go to work in Ottawa, 7 in the morning for us, 9 for Ottawa, and you stay till 7 at night, which is 11 in Ottawa. And then you go home to the suburbs where you live. So downtown is for work and making money. The architecture shows that. And now today, because we've had 7 years of low oil prices as well as changing technology, Calgary has more empty office space downtown than Vancouver has office space. And we built it so the only thing you could do with those buildings is have it as office space. Now, somebody today might say, well, who would have thought in the 1970s that a building would be other than single purpose? Well, let me tell you. In 1960s, in Toronto on Bloor Street, the building was built, the very first one in Canada that was a multi-purpose building. On street level, there were shops. Above those, there were offices, and above those, there were apartments. It was the Britannica building on land just north of the Victoria University. And so that model existed in the 60s. And in the 70s in downtown Toronto, and what became the banking district, the first of the major banks to build their towers that made a statement about them, the Toronto Dominion Bank, built those dark black office towers, and they built them and put in the plumbing and electricity that those buildings can be changed rather rapidly and cheaply to either hospitals if there's a dire emergency or to living accommodation. So again, that model was there in the world. Did we bother to ask? Not a chance. Stephen Lougheed, one of Peter's sons, when he becomes head of ARC, 3 years later, kills the vice president of Foresight. So there are no vice presidents of Foresight in Canada. Starting in about 2007 to 2011, there was a Premier's Commission developing an economic strategy for Calgary. And fundamentally, at least for Alberta, fundamentally what they said is be nicer to Indigenous people, spend less money, and stay with high carbon energy. Well, think about even 2008, Gwynne Dyer publishes Climate Wars, the first book that really begins to sound the alarm about what's going on. And by 2009 and 10, we knew a lot about ocean acidification, about soil degradation, about population. And that commission had access to all of it because I made sure they did. But they paid attention to none of it. There's not a hint in that commission's report that there's any threat to high carbon oil and gas in the future. In 2014, this is when, before the price of oil fell, when oil's still at $110 a barrel, Thomas Homer Dixon's invited to Alberta to talk about the future of high carbon energy. And he warns them that there are dangers about putting all your eggs in the high carbon energy basket. And we had lunch afterwards. And he said, Ruben, I think this may be my last trip to Alberta. They didn't like at all what I had to tell them. And sadly, then it means that the predominant public flavor of many of Alberta's elites, okay, so this is not ordinary Albertans. You saw in Calgary and Edmonton, they elect progressive mayors and a progressive council. But it's the elites in a country, those who have serious money and serious power, who actually run the place. And sadly, the predominant flavor of Alberta's elites are modern male, largely untouched by the women's movement. And they're committed to, organized for, and identified with success as a modern techno-industrial culture, society, and economy. Unconsciously, they agree with Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative. Which means that they're so identified with this that they're actively hostile to those who get in the way. To Ottawa, they've never forgiven Pierre Trudeau for the National Energy Project. I don't want to defend that. It was a mistake in the way that it was done. Something was needed at the time. We can argue about that. But Pierre did not ask me for my advice. But my point is that Justin Trudeau never had a chance in Alberta because the mere fact his name was Trudeau meant that there was a chip on the shoulder and prejudice. So that the phrase "fuck Trudeau," which was called to him publicly and openly in Ontario in the last election, has been on bumper stickers in Alberta on trucks for more than a decade. If you had in Ottawa people at a corner with a sign that said, honk if you hate Jews, we all know, or honk if you hate Muslims, we all know what would happen to those people and how rapidly. In Calgary, if you have a sign that says, honk if you hate Trudeau, nothing is done. And so there is in Alberta a resentment to Eastern Canada, to Ottawa, that is absolutely irrational. And therefore it's dangerous. Because the Tea Party in the US and then Donald Trump building on it is a living demonstration of what irrational, if you have irrational leaders and people who follow them, of where that takes you. And these folks are stirring up resentment that Albertans don't get their way when we put so much money into Ottawa and then threw it into Quebec. The figure that is bandied about is $640 billion over the last 40 years. And it's openly asserted that because we put that much more money into Ottawa than we get back, that therefore, if we want a pipeline through Quebec, we should get our pipeline, because after all, we pay for the damn country. This is serious stuff, folks. Lots of people laughed at the Tea Party without any sense of where it might take the US or the world. So Albertans are being worked into a snit with a big chip on their shoulders. We're becoming the next Quebec in Canada to officially say, of course we're part of Canada for everything we can get out of it. And we'll put into it as little as possible because we don't really belong here. But as long as there's something in it for us, we'll stay, but we'll go it alone if need be. And the folks who are saying this are organized and staffed and funded. Sadly, the government of Alberta and its political party, the UCP, are right in the middle of this. This is official. I've said nothing that the UCP do not say. I did not take the time to fish out the email that I received yesterday from the UCP about how scary the Trudeau government is, because they're at COP26 and the Alberta government deliberately sent no one to COP26. The Buffalo Declaration, as you may know, was written by sitting Conservative MPs, and it's equally outrageous. There is a separatist party now provincially and a separatist party federally, and there are people who should know better, full professors at the University of Calgary, who've written a book defending all of this and spewing this stuff and claim that it's how to think about Alberta's future. And let me tell you, if they were my students and they were learning from me how to think about the future, and this was their major project, they would fail. This is the equalization question. It's quite clear. Do you in Alberta think that equalization shouldn't be part of the Constitution? 62% of people said yes. So Alberta, in Ronald Wright's phrase, is progress trapped. In the phrase of social psychologists or sociologists, we're culture trapped. We're so deep into the mindset of 20th century modernity that we cannot imagine that there will ever be anything else, just better versions of 20th century modernity. And so economic growth is the overriding goal. Money is the only significant measure. We treat the sale of assets as earned income. That is, we are stealing from our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren. We are treating ourselves to a low tax regime. We pay roughly half of the services that we demand from governments. The other half comes from royalty and from our children and grandchildren. And we don't even talk about that. And so we have loose taxes, we have low taxes and loose regulations able to attract companies from other places. And every time we steal a company from some other part of Canada, we think we've succeeded and we give no thought to what it's done to the community they've come from. And we have a government that openly and consciously is going to turn Alberta into the last bastion of conservative neoliberalism. This means that we have a government that is going to turn Alberta into what Mississippi is to the United States, legally a part of the United States, but insists to this day that its culture is so different that it can have its own prejudices, including Jim Crow laws. So in summary, we in Alberta are unprepared and ill-equipped to cope with any future that deviates significantly from the MTI trajectory we have been on and that we imagine we are still on. And sadly, we suffer from self-inflicted wounds. This is the panel that Walt Kelly wrote for Earth Day, 1971, April 1st, the first Earth Day. And he's got Porcupine saying, it's hard walking on this stuff. Yep, son, we have met the enemy and he is us. My point here is the kind of humility and recognition that you see in Pogo Possum is incompatible with being a super successful modern male. Modern males that are super successful cannot admit that they are responsible for any of the trouble they're in. So let me just give you one example before I bore you to death. This is the XL pipeline for the Trans-Canada Pipeline. The brown line is the Keystone pipeline they had built years earlier. It starts in Hardisty, which is the collection point for heavy oil out of the oil sands and Cold Lake. And then the brown line goes down to almost into Montana, but then turns hard left to go into southern Manitoba, and then down the eastern side of North and South Dakota into Nebraska and beyond. So that pipeline's been in the ground, and as we meet today, it's pumping oil. And then TransCanada decides they want to twin that line. They want to double the size of the line. Now, the normal thing you do when you twin a line is you actually use the same right-of-way because you've gone through all the legal and other battles. It's a right-of-way that you own. And so you use the same right-of-way. There's still regulatory hurdles as to whether you should be able to do it, but far less trouble than actually choosing a new right-of-way. And so it's a question you might ask yourself, why would the board of TransCanada Pipelines approve a right-of-way that means you have to deal with not just 3 states, but now 4, Montana. And what's more, you're going through the largest aquifer in North America, which is what that blue splotch is about, in Nebraska and South Dakota. Remember, you're dealing with engineers who are mostly focused on money, and they know that the hypotenuse of a right angle triangle is shorter than the sum of the other 2 sides, and so they're going to save money. But they don't think with the right-hand side of their brain about the soft issues, about the fact that you're dealing with another state, about the fact that the people who are going to oppose that pipeline all vote Republican. And the assumption is, well, they're all Republicans, they're all for oil and gas, because all the Republicans they know in Oklahoma and Texas are all for oil and gas. But in fact, it's Republican ranchers with their shotguns in 3 states, Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska, who stop that line. It's not Ottawa, but to this day, the story you hear in Alberta from our elites is Justin Trudeau and Ottawa and the NEP and all of that. And there is no discussion to ask the question of the folks who were the board at the time of why did you choose the alignment you did. It's our fault, folks. Nobody did it to us. And so we suffer from a particularly vicious form of modern techno-industrial blindness. Now, we all know that every culture, every family, every company has blind spots. That's normal. In a world of infinite information, it's the state of affairs. And as Louise Penny said, that lovely Canadian author, nothing good ever came out of a blind spot. So the issue is not whether you have them, but is your blind spot particularly lethal? And I would argue that a blind spot at the heart of modernity is lethal. And that's the blind spot that comes out of the modern assumption that you only need 3 characteristics to succeed in a modern world. You must be logical, you must be rational, and you must be empirical. And if you take these 3 things and weave them together, you get science, technology, engineering, and math, all left brain male activity. The right brain, even though males have a right hemisphere, in Alberta, we do that when we're at home, not when we're at work. And it turns out that if you're rational, logical, and empirical, there's something you're missing that tends to come out of right-brained pattern recognition, and that's the pattern recognition that is required in order to be humble, in order to realize that you are the person being talked about here in a way that is shameful. So my conclusions are these. What are we in Alberta missing? only what we cannot yet see. And that yet is there as a statement of hope that we can learn. Albertans are not in any sense more evil or worse people than any place else. They are simply more successful as modern people and therefore more into believing modern mythology. We're deeper down that well. And in Alberta today, there is no serious effort to develop a whole of society, self-critically aware meta capacity and the supportive infrastructure that's required for us to face, explore, come to understand, and respond with courage to the truly strategic issues we must face and deal with today, let alone out to 2050 or 2105, which would be our next centennial. We have much to talk over with each other. So here are 5 critical things that we in Alberta do not yet know about ourselves and our situation. We don't know that whither Alberta is now a truly open question. In other words, we don't know that we can't just get Alberta back on the high energy bandwagon and it's all going to be good. And yes, we talked today about adding some high tech to it. But remember, 1/3 of the office space in downtown Calgary is empty. That's going to take a long time to fill. We could turn out to be the next Cleveland or the next Mississippi, rather than what we think of as the next Texas. And of course, people who know Texas will point out that more people are employed in renewable energy in Texas than in the oil and gas business. We don't know that we're progress and culture trapped as modern people, and we need to transcend that. What's worse, we don't know that time's up for our modern form of culture. And we don't know that modern cultures are self-limiting. Now, in one sense, that's good news, because if you're worried about modernity running amok for the next 300 years, it's not going to happen. It will have caused species death by then if we insist on using it. But it is self-limiting in a destructive way, if in no other way. What's more, we don't understand that climate change is only a symptom of ecological overshoot. In other words, the belief that has even been spoken about, it is a deep belief that you will hear again and again at COP26 in Glasgow this week. And that is that if we can deal with climate change and find a magic source of energy that's clean and plentiful, we can keep economic growth going forever. When, of course, all that does is speed up the pace at which we collapse through ecological overshoot. That's not understood at COP26. That's not an idea you're going to hear repeatedly by any of the major leaders. And it's worse. Ecological overshoot is only a symptom of our MTI way of grasping and being grasped by reality. So the work we have to do to transcend modernity is extraordinarily deep learning. And that the only way out requires that Albertans come to understand the above 4 points and commit to new ways to grasp and be grasped by reality, and that this entails a metanoia experience. Metanoia, you may remember, is the Greek word for turning about. So turning about is what you do if you're hiking in the mountains and you climb up over a ridge, and now you can see to the northwest, which you couldn't see before because of the mountain in front of you. And you can see that a storm is coming that looks as if it may be dangerous enough to threaten you. And you remember that about a mile back, there was a cabin you could seek shelter in. And so you turn about in order to seek shelter and security. Metanoia is also the experience of alcoholics who are now dry when they say, I finally hit the bottom of the bottle. We in Alberta are not anywhere close yet to a metanoia experience. And I fear what it will take to get us there. So in my final conclusions, it's no surprise that Alberta should struggle with its future. This is perfectly normal for extraordinarily successful male-dominated MTI cultures. However, being entrepreneurial and successful with new technologies and the old MTI imagination just makes things worse. The key is to learn to see ours as a truly rare time in human history in which personal to civilizational transcendence is required. And what's more, it's already developing within, among, and around us. So once we recognize that, then we need to learn to cooperate with this evolution. It's our own evolution as persons, families, and organizations, and we can do so with hope. And ironically, this franchise is still available. No one on the planet has figured this out to the point that there's a jurisdiction, be it a city or a wider jurisdiction, that is openly committed to the project of transcending modernity so that it can become a truly a successful culture, not just in the 21st century, but of the 21st century. So I leave you with this question. What are the chances that Alberta will become the first society to openly commit to becoming a transmodern culture? It's a hope I hold. Over to you. Thank you. The future is in our hands, hearts, minds, and spirits.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ruben. That was an absolutely fabulous presentation. It really brought back a lot of my memories of my life in Alberta when I was growing up, and you explained a lot of the reasons why I'm so perplexed when I went back to Alberta after a 20-year hiatus, why things were so different. And because the people that I know in Alberta are not these elites that are making these absolutely ridiculous decisions, I'll call them, as opposed to what I really am thinking they are. So I thank you for that, and that's really important. I do have some questions I would like to ask, but I will defer at the moment, and I will come in with my questions at a later time. I have John Legg up first, followed by John Meyer on deck. So John Legg, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
Thank you, Jean. Ruben, that really was a mind opener. An eye opener, yes, but mind opener. I made a bunch of small generalizations when I wrote my question, and it had to do with comparing what I was told that the origin of political parties in BC were. I noticed when I lived in BC that there seemed to be quite easily identifiable a right party. It was clear what the views were. There was also a left party. And the reason for this, I was told by a longtime BC resident, was that the origin of many of the cities were, the origins were that they grew out of one company towns. So you had the owners and you had the workers represented in these two parties. Now, if you go to the federal level, you have these two parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives. And of course, there are differences, but the differences are not as stark. Now, my question is, using that simplistic explanation I received about BC's political parties, can the same be said about the political parties in Alberta, or is it simply a different world? There's my question.
If you live in BC, you know that those people on the other side of the mountains are relatives, but they're a bit strange. And you also know that they feel the same way about you. So it's a dramatically different world. I mean, just very, very quickly, Albertans have yet to re-elect the same government, the same governing party, once it's got rid of them. So that the first governing party in Alberta were the Liberals, because there were Liberals in Ottawa, and they set it up in a way that the Liberals would be elected here. And that lasted till 1921, when the United Farmers of Alberta were elected. And it was coming out of a community sense, that cooperative community sense. When the UFA was elected in 1921, they weren't even registered as a political party.
Ah.
They were a social movement. And so what you get in Alberta are social movements. And the social credit government was also a social movement, came out of a social movement. You may know some of the history of that. I won't bore you with it. They lasted for 37, 42 years, somewhere in there. By the time they were exhausted, Peter Lougheed came along with a progressive conservative party, not at all like the present conservative party in Alberta, because the progressive conservative party of Peter Lougheed was very similar to the progressive conservative party of Joe Clark or Bob Stanfield or others, in which we had nationally a kind of center party leaning a little left and one leaning a little right, but in most ways indistinguishable, which is why we were happy to replace one with the other. The sad thing about the Progressive Conservative Party, and I lay it at the hands of the same male elites, because they've dabbled in fixing the elections as to who got elected. But since Peter Lougheed is the only premier in the Conservative Party who has retired on his own terms, every other premier, and there have been 8 of them, has either been fired by the party or defeated in an election. So that party, which governed for 47 years, has yet, it was not able to elect one leader who was stable and sound enough to govern their full term and retire on their own terms. And so Alberta, in that sense, is becoming increasingly polarized. And the United Conservative Party is very much a conservative party of the right. They make no pretense to being the old Progressive Conservative Party. And there is no party of any significance in the middle. The Liberals are dead, and the Alberta Party doesn't amount to anything. And therefore, we in Alberta are now polarized in Alberta the way they are in BC, but through a very different history. Because now it's people, but the ultimate motivation is the same. It's successful people with money who want to protect it against godless socialists who are going to take it away from them and make them share.
Oh, bravo, bravo. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben and John. Good question. I'd like to call on John Meyer, and on deck I have Peter Balkowski.
Yeah, in my question, I'm going to be stepping on Miles' legs question a little bit, but maybe it'll be a good segue. But first of all, I wanted to say that I don't see growth as necessary in an economy. There are certain sectors. I think we have to differentiate between the real wealth creation sector and the transfer of the speculative money printing sector. The speculators, the money printers, they absolutely have to have a growing economy. The real wealth producers don't. Farmers don't need to produce more milk or wheat. Widget producers don't need to produce more widgets. Doctors don't need to see more patients. We're fine doing the level of activity we are now. So with that disconnected lead up, I'd like to ask my question, which is, once you discount the business that we've done in the oil business in Alberta, discount it for debt and legacy costs, the Alberta deficit, the provincial deficit, accumulated deficit, I believe is $100 billion. The accumulated remediation costs for the oil sands and conventional oil are up around 100 to 250 billion. And the oil sands is a good part of that. To me, the oil sands is not, as the oil sands is differentiated from conventional oil, is not a viable sector once you take out the debt, once you subtract the debt cost. So my question is, when all these costs are included in the calculation, never mind the environmental impacts, can the oil sands be seen as a viable business if they actually paid their bills?
That's a big if, because paying their bills is not like you and I paying our monthly bill to TELUS or Shaw for our communications. Paying our bills is a function at the societal level, is a function of what's the agreement among the people in a society about what it is to pay bills. And in Alberta, the agreement that we have worked on is an agreement that we will not count inconvenient costs as costs.
Yeah.
Now, I would argue, I've seen research of people who have applied the same form of thinking, John, to the modern economy generally, and basically argue that it's really a Ponzi scheme. Mm-hmm. In other words, that it's not just the oil patch that doesn't meet this standard. None of the modern economy meets this standard, but that's a side issue. So is the oil patch sustainable? If you do, I mean, none of us know how to do full cost accounting, but we could do more inclusive accounting than we now do. And if we did that, the answer is probably no. Is it sustainable from the point of view of if you count CO2 per barrel? The answer is no. The oil that we produce in Alberta from the oil sands is among the most carbon heavy in the world in terms of what it costs to produce and refine it. But if you ask the question, will the oil sands continue? If you want your money to be safe, bet on that. Because what you're hearing, even at COP26, as the way forward, is that that we can keep our modern, because ultimately the question is, can we keep our modern way of living? And as a society, we all agree, not everybody, individuals, but the society nets out as the answer to that is yes. We're going to make modernity sustainable even if it kills us. I would argue it will. And that we're better to come to terms with the fact we can't make modernity sustainable. But the myth that modernity can be made sustainable is alive and well at COP26. And the basic strategy is to use tons of public money to capture and store and to some extent use carbon. And that's very explicit in Alberta. It's the official policy of the government of Alberta. And most citizens in Alberta haven't thought about this deeply enough that, in fact, they simply go along with it, thinking that it's a small price to pay because we get to kind of keep all this going.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just on carbon capture, it doesn't work. The EROI of the oil sands is about 3.5 to 1, 4 to 1. And once you add in carbon capture, it drops, into, well, it's already extremely low. So anyway, thanks very much. Great presentation.
Thank you, John, for your question. Next, we have Peter Bolkowski, and on top we have Miles Flag. And Miles, I know you have two questions, so you might want to see if you can combine them together. Anyway, so Peter, over to you.
Hi, Ruben. I am very definitely one of your MTI people. 3 degrees in chemistry, 40 years in the oil patch, mostly in the oil sands. Some offshore and some Saskatchewan, some Manitoba, a bit of BC, some Algeria, but they're very definitely an MTI. You gave us a great diatribe on how bad things are and how bad things are going to get. But I didn't hear from you what type of society, what type of economy do you see as the alternative for Alberta, for Canada, for the Western world, for India, for China, for Bangladesh, for Africa? What type of society, what type of economy? Whether we like it or not, we have close to 8 billion people. Oil and gas and coal and hydro and nukes provide the energy for communications, mobility, shelter, and food for literally billions of people. So great to say that this society is no good, but what type of society, what type of economy do you see that deals with the reality that there are close to 8 billion people and many do not have the standard of living that most of the people in KCOR, most of, the 1 or 2% of the population of Canada do. My daughter cannot afford to buy her own place. She has a professional job. She has a diploma from a community college. She's working full time. She cannot afford to buy her place. So, tell me your vision of the society and economy to come.
Well, 2 quick comments before I do that. One is, I don't want in any way to be heard to say this society, that our modern society is no good. I'm as modern as you are, Peter, that if you were raised at all, as I assume most of us on this call were, conceivably all of us, but that may not include everybody, in a modern society with modern presuppositions, the fact is we're all modern, and it's not in any sense a question of moral good or evil. You're not responsible for the length of your arm, and none of us are responsible for the culture we're born into or the way we become enculturated. The issue that I'm pointing out is that the research has now been done that makes it clear, not yet widely understood, but it makes it clear that the path we're on is a path to death. In other words, your daughter will have a worse life than you did, and her children than she did, and their children than they did. We're on a downhill path, and the sooner we come to terms with that, the better off we'll be. So this is not about moral good or bad in any sense. It's about coming to terms with our actual situation and having the courage to face up to it. Now, as for what's next, the honest answer is we don't know. We know enough about complex living systems to know that when they change their fundamental state, you cannot predict, you cannot state the state that they will turn into. We know some of the things we would like. We would like to keep all the stuff we've got and the standard of living we've got and have that for 9 billion people. Not a ghost of a chance that's going to happen. My point is, there is no place in the world that takes seriously enough the points I've been trying to make here, that there's a franchise here. And there's literally a franchise. We'll spend hundreds of billions of dollars on carbon capture and storage. That's a foregone conclusion. That's baked in. We will also come to spend hundreds of billions of dollars probing your question, not in the sense of what is it we want and how do we get there, but how do we understand enough about whole forms of civilization as complex living systems? There's no place in the world that specializes in that now. There's franchises here to have people put to work to do good work and to be paid, and to have other people in the world who are catching on to it to come and say, you seem to be the only place doing this work. Can we learn with you and from you? And some of those people have money to pay us, and some of them will say, we don't have any money. We'll say, come anyway. I'm saying Alberta can become a place on the planet that at one and the same time as we're trying to hold on to, mistakenly, modernity, we also make a commitment to moving beyond it. But you cannot pre-state that system, but we know some of the conditions. We know that the production consumption levels will be dramatically reduced to anything that we're used to. But the fact is, as a species, we've hardly begun to think seriously about these questions. And COP28 is COP26 is a demonstration of that. The thinking at COP26 is what you found in the cutting edge research about 15 years ago. They're about 15 years behind the edge of the research.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. The next question we have is from Miles Flagg, and following that, Mike Nickerson. Miles, you're muted. There you go.
Thank you. Wow, thanks, Ruben. First of all, just to kind of color my next question, have you ever heard that the CIA meddled in the Diefenbaker election and got Pearson elected? Have you ever encountered that story?
I have not, but God knows, Alberta is increasingly open to conspiracy theories.
Okay, so now with that in mind, and yeah, conspiracy theories, it's like, well, whose conspiracy do you want to jump on board to? But my question is related to, and I'm in Alberta, I'm in Calgary. I worked with Rick McIver for several years, very closely, and helped get him reelected. But I left when the Progressive Conservatives changed to the United Conservative Party, UCP. 10 years ago, I asked Rick McIver in a public meeting, I said, I'm concerned about what's going on up there in the tar sands. And I said, because I can't seem to get a clear indication of where we're at with remediation of these tailings. And I said, I don't want my children being stuck with the bill. And it turns out, since then, there's been a report, and he agreed with me, by the way, that this would be unacceptable. There turns out there's a government report that estimates cleanup to be between 100 billion and 250 billion. And in fact, a woman who worked in the oil sands at that meeting told me that indeed the Alberta government has actually even extended the grandfather clause or whatever to 70 years for oil companies to figure out how they're going to clean it up. Like, talk about kicking the can down the road and dumping it on future generations. It's abhorrent when I think about it. Now, another related question and for thoughts from you is, how come after 70 years of an oil and gas industry, are we only now all concerned about pursuing world price for our oil after basically 70 years of the USA sucking at the teat and the Koch brothers becoming billionaires off of Alberta oil? Now we're finally, we got to get world price. We got to get oil to the West Coast so we can have it on a, tidewater. Any thoughts on those questions?
Well, the situation with the oil sands, if I had to put money on it, I would bet they'll never be dealt with. They'll be dealt with by nature, as whatever nature does, which probably means that some of those dikes will burst. So anyway, that I don't see Albertans or Canadians as having the capacity, the gumption, to actually face up to the situation we've got and actually dealing with it. I don't like that conclusion, but if you have to put money on it, that's where I would put my money. As for others, we've had a pretty easy ride in terms of developing our oil sands, developing the oil and gas business. There have been lots of people in Texas who were welcome to come up and teach us how to do it. When I was in grade school in Calgary in the 40s and 50s, the only new kids in the class were the oil kids. all the other kids in the class were from the community. We knew each other, but inevitably some father would get appointed back from Calgary to Oklahoma City or Houston, and some other person would come and they would have kids. So we were always curious about the new oil kids. So I mean, that's been going on. We've been able to build on their knowledge and then own it ourselves and become as good at that as anybody in the world. And the conditions were such that we could make a lot of money. We could get we could sell our oil. So it wasn't an issue. I mean, there's a sense in which the world price for oil only became an issue once we seriously got into the oil sands. Once our conventional oil has always sold close enough to world price, it doesn't matter, because we work in Canadian dollars, and since Diefenbaker, we've not for every year, but by and large, since Diefenbaker, we've had a discounted Canadian dollar, even more than Diefenbaker's 92.5 cents. And so we've actually, so I'm not all that worried. My concern is, can we in Alberta, are there a critical mass of us who could begin to do in Alberta something that would be kind of the analog of what Senator Cameron did? He wasn't a senator then, but in the 30s, when we were all poor and down on our uppers, he said we have to learn to talk about the place of the arts in our life. He wanted to change the conversation dramatically. And out of that came the Banff Center. And do we have the capacity to change the conversation again? We can't fix all this other stuff. We sometimes in life have to acknowledge it's there and kind of put up with it. But can we begin to do a new thing that would be truly helpful, not only for us, but for the planet? I don't know.
Good answer, Ruben. Thank you. Mike Nickerson, you're up. And after Mike is Mary Hagan.
Well, Ruben, that was a perfect segue, because my question is about punching a hole in this materialistic culture that we're acclimatized and culturated in, because it doesn't hold a future for us. The whole consume and dispose of is at the root of overshoot. A lot of people, a lot of the good ideas, or the ideas of making the material transition, they're good, but they require governments or big corporations, lots of money, lots of human effort. But any individual who's concerned about climate or inequality or conflict can look toward doing more with life and less with stuff. We say more fun, less stuff, as a encapsulation of that. And perhaps you'd carry on that a little bit, because we really do need somehow to break this materialistic mindset and get into the possibilities. You can have a whole lot more fulfilling life with a hugely reduced amount of material throughput, and that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a question in there, is do you agree with Mike? I'm delighted to see you again after all these years, and to see you still at work that you have been at so faithfully all your life. I absolutely agree with you. One of the reasons I talk about this, which may be heard as strange language, about the way our modern world grips reality and our grip on it, and the way we allow it to grip us, is that I see that we're not going to be able to deal with the business of, oh, we'll just consume less and whatever else, without, in fact, profound metanoia experiences. These are experiences that are the kind of experiences that in our culture we tend to talk of as spiritual, if not at least deeply psychological. And we talk about them as experiences that change our lives, that we used to see sunsets or our grandchildren or whatever it is in one way, and we now see them in others. So that my point is that most of the conversation about sustainability in the modern world is at the wrong level of discussion. It's still about doing stuff with stuff, as if we can manipulate our way into the future, as opposed to saying, what's at issue here is the very way we have been formed as modern people and the way we have been taught to experience our own life and that of others.
We're sort of talking about a reversal of the economia, because back when industrial production finally was flooding the market with so much stuff, we had to be taught to consume it. We started to lose our ability, or our time spent relating and learning and sport and music and all that stuff. So it's not totally unfamiliar territory to the human experience. We're not saying, you know, tighten your belt. We're saying there's a world of experience here that you'll find more fulfilling than what we've got coming. Let's go there, and that can be a big help.
Yes, but it is also saying, particularly those of us who are modern males, this means you have to be open to the both lobes of your brain and to the integration thereof to the extent you can. This is hard work for modern males. It's harder work than it is for women. And even the women don't understand that. I mean, modern males are in way more trouble than we know. And you see that in the fact that our young men are not going to university. I mean, young men, 15-year-olds to 24-year-olds in the modern world are in far more serious trouble than we know. That's not a sidelight, that's a function of the evolution of our culture right now. And there's no analog of a men's movement that is healing. The only men's movement we've got are white fascists who are angry that their version of being a male isn't working. And I understand their anger, but we don't have the kind of supportive healing that the women's movement represented to women.
Wow.
Good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. And I think that's a fabulous segue for Mary. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. Ruben, nice to be with you again. It's been
Yes.
a long time. And I always find your foresights absolutely fascinating. And in your presentation, one very small comment triggered my thinking. I must confess, I haven't given up hope for Alberta. Actually, I see it has amazing potential. So I'll hang on to that. But you talked about the male mind and saying when they're at home, they might work with the right side of the brain, but they certainly don't do that at their paid work, sort of thing. And I was wondering how one could waken the kind of satisfactions that men get in their full life, in their home life, even in their volunteerism, because I do agree that Alberta is very strong on community work and volunteerism in that respect. So how could one really pick up on that component if the work life is in a bad way right now?
Well, for me, one of the blessings of COVID is that, and there are blessings in COVID, one of the blessings is that it has slowed virtually all of us down a whole lot. And many people, not all, but I'm quite a bit surprised, but really pleased at how many people, if you get into a quiet conversation, admit that they have been rethinking some of their lives and realizing that they don't want to go back to what was the old normal. And there's even been some research on it. 64% of the people who are Canadians said, I do not want the old normal restored as my new normal. I want some fundamental changes. And that's a story I've been trying to tell to help us be sensitive to that I don't want to be heard as saying that Albertans are bad or that it's hopeless. I'm saying we're locked into stuff, and in part we're locked into it because at the moment we're frightened. We've been traumatized by 7 years of low oil prices and a lack of public leadership that would help us process that in a healthy way. And so we should be dealing with Albertans the same way we should be dealing with our American cousins, as people suffering from PTSD, that they've been traumatized in an unprocessed way, and so they process it badly, which is absolutely clear in the US. It's increasingly clear in Alberta. And that's the risk. And can we nip it in the bud here, so to speak? Can there be enough sanity and raise this publicly in a way to help us see that, in fact, many of us, whether in Alberta or other places, actually are hungry for a world that doesn't have all the same features of the one we left because of COVID, or we left in Alberta because the price of oil went from $110 to $40 and then down to 30. Of course, at one point, it only happened overnight, but it was true at a particular period overnight. People still producing and selling oil at that very moment were actually paying the people who bought their oil to buy their oil. In other words, oil was priced negatively. And that's a shock for a company, for a society that has been so unconsciously dependent on its wealth. So I too am hopeful. I have not given up by any sense. For good or for ill, as I say to my friends here, you're stuck with me. And I'm stuck with you. So we might as well learn to talk to each other and hug and smile and engage and work at it.
Can I just build on one piece of this with a quick question, Jean, if I may? What is the role of modern entrepreneurial women in Albertan society?
They're quite remarkable. At the moment, they're not yet developed to the stage where they're ready to ask themselves, what's our societal role? But they're absolutely smart enough to know that they're in a male culture that, compared to much of the rest of Canada, is somewhat off the scale, and that they need to support each other, so that the women's networks in Calgary and in Alberta are quite remarkable. Occasionally, they honor me by asking me to meet with them and speak to them and think about these things. And they're very protective of their own. They're providing protection, safe spaces where women can grow and compete successfully in what is still a far too male world. And my hope is that they will, once they've done enough of that and are confident enough, that they will begin to ask the question of how do we make societal differences that make differences for the future of Alberta. It's too much to ask them to take that on right now. They're not ready. It's like asking a 12-year-old to be the head of the house if both his parents die. The kid's not old enough by any standard. You got to protect the kid longer, and maybe by the time you're 17, you can take on some of those responsibilities, but not at 12. And so I say that not in any way prejudicially. I am delighted by, and you got to know that I was raised by strong prairie women. My grandmother and my mother were dear friends of Nellie McClung, because she lived just down the street from Wesley United Church, where I went because my mother carried me to the nursery. And so I grew up with stories of the roles being played by strong prairie women, and have come to absolutely value and defend that. And I'm not in any way to be heard as attacking my male colleagues. I do want to say, though, that most of them have passed by several thousand opportunities to become more reflexive and grow up, and they've missed them all. And it's time we started paying attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary and Ruben, for that. And I think our final questions will come from Ted. Up to
You're
you,
a tough
Ted.
act to follow, Ruben. We've been trying for a while through the Club of Rome to try and get people to think that there are values other than just making big bucks or controlling the ones that are traditionally sort of male stereotypes. And so I'm finding it a little bit interesting now because there are very few success stories of Alberta-like places that we could look at as possible models. We're looking, but it strikes me that it's my brain hurts moving from global to local, because I spent a lot of time this week on COP stuff, and then to flip to this level. And it's clear that there are some discontinuities between what folks are saying globally and what folks are saying locally, and really how they're thinking. So it leads to a couple of questions. I'll put the other one first. Are the assumptions different in Alberta regarding futures, causes, and repercussions as they are in the rest of the world or in the rest of Canada? And then to follow up that specifically, therefore, one of the big things that people's pushing is the idea of stopping subsidizing fossil fuel extraction or any aspects of fossil fuel. And it's quite clear that in Glasgow, a lot of people are getting behind this and making a lot of noises, and so are NGOs. So the final question would be, how is that going to resonate in Alberta?
Well, to deal with your final question last, first, I mean, of course, Albertans as persons and as families and whatnot respond in a whole variety of ways. The official kind of response in Alberta, driven by the government and by a good percentage of the oil patch, is that we are under attack and we must defend ourselves, and they are evil, and we must make sure that this is very much a Manichaean game. In other words, the thinking is very much the thinking of Stephen Harper, who claims to be a good Christian, but Manichaeism was declared by the Christian church to be a heresy. You cannot divide the world into a fight of good and evil. That leads you into all kinds of bad places. But that's what's happening in Alberta, and the Premier is, in my view, is conscious of the fact that it serves him well to divide out, to have Albertans become divisive and not speak to each other, in the same way as it serves Donald Trump well to have people who are so divisive, they hate people who disagree with them. And so the response in Alberta that I fear is that we will be taken down a road of societal fragmentation and warfare that you see being played out in the United States, in Hungary, in Poland, and that it will take root in Alberta in a way that, because it isn't taking root to the same extent in other parts of Canada, my fear is other parts of Canada don't understand what's going on here, and even how dangerous it is to them ultimately. Because this cancer...
Can they be bought off or persuaded, or is it gotten beyond
I
that?
think my sense is, that, I've forgotten who it was, I think it was Buckminster Fuller said that, in effect, if you have people focused on a bad future, don't badmouth them, attract them with an even better future. And what's lacking is the kind of imagination. I mean, Justin Trudeau, God bless him, is in one sense a reasonably skilled politician, enough to get himself reelected and to do some, quote, good things. But he doesn't have the kind of imagination that Mike Pearson had. Mike Pearson absolutely understood that Canada in his time was in a crossroads, and that Canada didn't understand that, and that he couldn't wait for Canadians to understand it, because by then it would be too late. So he had to take the risk of doing initiatives that, in his view, would help deal with this situation. but without there being much in the way of a cheering section. There was no great demand for a Canadian flag. There was no great demand for bilingualism. There was no great demand in terms of the whole country, even for the Canada Health Act. Pearson, in my view, saved Canada and turned it onto a path that let it succeed in the latter half of the 20th century and into the early 21st century. We now need that same quality of imagination to say nationally, what we're going to be doing in and with Alberta is only a subpart of what we're also doing in different ways in different places with a different national project. The national project of Canada is still far too much. We're going to make modernity last forever.
So are there some women or men out there who are capable of taking up that leadership?
I assume that there are. The space for them has not been created. The CBC hasn't created it. There's nothing happening on the CBC that would call forth these people. We have a dragon's den that is its 15th year, that entirely reinforces a modern mentality about money and stuff.
So and where's Mr. Dress Up when we really need him?
And so where is Mr. Dress Up? No, but I mean, in that sense, we used to have a national film board that the CBC board was once capable of these discussions because people like Northrop Frye were on it. The National Film Board was capable of these discussions in the 60s and the 70s. I used to represent the government of Canada on the Film Board's Challenge for Change project. So I know we had institutions at a time in which the board of those institutions was filled with human beings who could handle these discussions. I'm going to now make a statement for which I only have impressions, but I think my money is safe. And the statement is, I'll bet you a day's wages, flat even, your day's wages against mine, that half the university boards in Canada could not handle this conversation. They would not know what to do with it. And that's the statement.
Any takers?
The CBC can't do with it. Film board isn't there anymore. So in that sense, we not only lack heroic individuals, we lack the institutional infrastructure and support system. And for me, that's the critical piece. We need a new support system to help make it safe for these. It's what the women's networks in Calgary have done for women entrepreneurs in Calgary and Alberta. They're smart.
Great answer, Ruben. Thank you. Yeah,
that's wonderful, Ruben. Thank you. You've managed to bring it from Alberta to the national and then back to local again. That's wonderful. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to Ruben for an absolutely fantastic presentation that you gave today. As I said at my first thank you, you really brought it back to me, sort of what the situation is with respect to what's going on in Alberta, and wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you very, very much. And so on behalf of Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would like to thank you for this presentation. It will be up online very soon on our YouTube channel. And so I'd invite anybody here who wants to please visit our website, canadiancore.com, so that you can look and find the videos and all the other presentations that have been made to our organization online, and look for those. And I'd encourage everybody to look through our website and look for things. If you're interested in membership, you can certainly do that online as well, and appreciate that. And if you do use the video, look at our YouTube channel, I encourage you to subscribe to that if you want, and it will make things a little easier for you to find things in the future. While you are going through the canadiancore.com website, I would encourage you to look at some of the extra pages. There's a place that says stay informed. And if you register for that, you will get a weekly update of all of the oncoming presentations and things that have been new in the website. This is something that you have to do, and it would work for you. Anyway, it would work to get the new presentations that are coming up as well. So with that, I would like to again say thank you very much, Ruben. This has been a wonderful presentation.